Children, obey your parents as you would the Lord, because this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may have a long life in the land. Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord.
Thank you for reading that, Matthew. Just having a little technical difficulties. Let me get this up real quick. There we go. I know that scripture reading was much shorter than last week. Sorry, Isaac. We're back on track in our series. And just to kind of refresh us of what we've been doing, we've been going over roles and responsibilities. That's been one of our themes for this year. And this is kind of connected to what it means to be in a covenant. When you're in a covenant with someone, you have designated roles and responsibilities. And throughout this series, I've rooted all of it in putting on the new self. So this is a slide I showed you a couple weeks ago, and I just want to show you where we are. That we started with the new self here. And the new self is going to be the foundation for everything that comes, that we've been looking at and we will continue to look at. That everything is rooted in us putting on the image of Christ, us imitating Christ, being more Christ-like. So we started with the new self, and then we looked at the family unit in general. And what the Bible has to say about the family unit, roles and responsibilities of being a part of a family. And then a couple weeks ago, we looked at husbands and wives. And we looked at the roles and responsibilities of being a husband, being a wife, and how the husband and wife relationship is really the foundation for the family. That is the central figure within the family. Now this morning, we're going to move on to parents and children. In the coming weeks, we're going to start looking at the new self and what that means for us within the church. Roles and responsibilities we have in the church, various offices, elders, deacons, evangelists. The roles and responsibilities we have based on gender, based on age, based on our own talents and what we're able to contribute. So we'll look at those in the coming weeks. But this is just to kind of refresh us of where we are now. Now we're going to be looking at parents and children. And I want to say the same thing now that I said when we looked at the roles and responsibilities of husbands and wives, which is that even if you're not a parent, even if you don't have children, this is still an important lesson. I talked about this with marriage. Even if you're not married, it's still important to know what the Bible teaches about marriage for a number of reasons. It teaches us about God, but it also teaches us about Christians among us, what they're going through, how we can encourage them, or how we may even have to admonish them at times. And the same thing is true about parents and children. Even if you don't have children, you still should be aware of what God has to say about parents and children, because that is a huge part of the Bible, of understanding the relationship between parents and children, between fathers and sons, especially in connection with God and the Father and Jesus. So learning all of this helps us not just to understand God in the Bible, but to understand what our fellow Christians are going through, so that we can encourage them, so that maybe we can correct them at times, which can be a very hard thing to do, but we do have that responsibility. So this is what we're going to be looking at, parents and children, and what this means. Because if you don't have children, you either have or at one point had parents. All of us were children. So we're going to be looking at this now a little bit. And we're going to do exactly what I've been doing. We're going to look at a general picture of some interesting points that the Bible gives on parents and children. And then we're going to look at the roles and responsibilities, very specific ones that are outlined here in Ephesians 6. Very generally, though, I'm going to have a couple passages that we're going to look at. And for the sake of time, I will have them up on the board for you, and they're all taken from the ESV. So the parents and children, what does the Bible have to say about parents? The first thing I want to point out is that parents are a unit made up of male and female. We live in a time where this really has to be emphasized. This is the biblical teaching. The parents, first of all, are a unit. It is not one person's responsibility to raise the children. This is, and I want to be clear about this, that this lesson is on the biblical view of how to raise children, or how to be a child and have parents. For some people, this isn't their experience, but I want to focus on the biblical view. So first of all, parents are a unit. It's not just one person. This is a unified relationship. These are married people, male and female, who are raising children. It's very important that a child has both a male and female leader in their lives so that they can have these different perspectives. Very important for the sake of the child to have this. I didn't put it in this lesson. I did a lot of research on this lesson. And one of the things I researched was actually comparing the New Testament view with what even sociologists have to say. And the sociological evidence lines up with Scripture so much, it's shocking how much it's not talked about. That sociologists, in their research, demonstrate that a child needs both a male and female perspective in order to have a good foundation and in order not to get into trouble later in life. That's actually one of the factors that that contributes to being able to guess delinquency in children is their relationship with their parents, even more so than the child's own behavior. That they could actually guess more accurately whether a child would have delinquent behavior later in life based on the child's parents than based on the child's own behavior. So parents are a unit made up of male and female, biblical point of view. Another biblical point of view, that parenthood comes from God. Very important. We don't give ourselves children, God does. So you have a number of passages that I'll read like these two. Genesis 30 verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. God is the one doing this. Or in Genesis 48 verses 8 through 9, when Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" And Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons whom God has given me here." God is the one who gives people children. That's a very important point of view, not just here, but really what we're going to get into, especially when understanding the parents' responsibilities. That these are God's children that they have given to you, and that you have a responsibility to take care of according to God's discipline and instructions. So parenthood comes from God. Parents set examples for their children. So in 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 4 through 5, this is God speaking to Solomon. And God says, "And as for you, if you will walk before me, as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel." And this becomes an example for all the kings. In fact, when you read about a king who does well in 1st and 2nd Kings and in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it will often say he walked according to his father David. It may say a different father, but it's often according to his father David. So parents set examples for their children to follow in. Another biblical point of view, and I said this with marriage, that Bible doesn't require parenthood. No one is guaranteed to have children, and no one must have children. Now, I want to be clear that if a married couple does not want children only because they want to live their lives how they want to live, that's not a very biblical or God-oriented attitude. That's more focused on me, and children impinge on my wants. That's not a good reason. That's not a godly reason for not having children. However, the Bible does not require parenthood of anyone. So that's just some interesting points of the biblical view of parents. Now the biblical view of children. First thing I want to point out, very, very important, especially in the Old Testament, that children deeply affect their parents with their actions. Deeply affect them. So, of course, this is a huge theme throughout Proverbs, and I just have a couple of them here, but you could find this elsewhere. So Proverbs chapter 10, the second part of verse 1 there, a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. Or Proverbs 23, verses 24 and 25, the father of the righteous will greatly rejoice. He who fathers a wise son will be glad in him. Let your father and mother be glad. Let her who bore you rejoice. The Bible affirms, what those of you who are parents, I'm sure, have experienced, that your children deeply affect you. How they behave, how they act, whether they behave righteously or wickedly, deeply affects the parents. Another biblical view of children is it's not just that parents set examples for children, but actually children set example for parents and for adults. So Jesus in Matthew 18, verses 2 through 4, Jesus says, truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So children also have things to teach adults. It's a very mutual relationship. It's not just that parents must bring them up to be like them. Parents can learn a lot from children as well. Another thing the Bible teaches about children, in continuing with Jesus' words here, is that children are to be protected and not caused to stumble. So carrying on in verse 5, Jesus continues, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. If you don't know what a millstone is, we actually have some. And by the way, those are small millstones. This is a great millstone to be fastened around someone's neck. So children are to be protected and not caused to stumble. We don't put stumbling blocks in their way. We instead teach them about God truthfully so that they can have a relationship with God. Another biblical view of children is that children belong to God. This was really ingrained in Israel, especially with the firstborn. So there's this command here in Exodus chapter 13 and verse 2 where God says, consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and of beast, is mine. It was ingrained into them from the very beginning. These are not your children, they are God's children, and you treat them accordingly, and you understand this. So children belong to God. They are little people. They don't belong to the parents. God gives children, and children belong to God, but parents guide them and watch over them with this all in mind. So this is just some general information about parents and children that the Bible teaches. So now I'd like to get into our passage here. And if you're not already there, please open your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 6. We're going to first start with, as Paul does, the roles and responsibilities of children. Ephesians chapter 6, starting in verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land. So children really only have one responsibility, but before I get into that, I'm going to start with this, and I'm going to end with this. that the relationship between parents and children is centered around God. That is so important for understanding verses 1 through 4. So you have in verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord. The reason and how you obey your parents is in the Lord. The parents, in verse 4, are to bring up the children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. It is totally God-oriented. This relationship is all about God. And if the relationship is without God, or if God is just a segment of the relationship or a small part of it, then how this relationship is designed to flourish will be lost. I'm going to say that again. In the parent-child relationship, if God is not central or occupies a small part of it, the design for flourishing will be lost because it is designed to flourish with God. And when God is taken out of the picture, there will be consequences because this is designed by God. Children are a gift from God and they belong to God. This relationship has to be totally God-oriented. This is what Paul means, verse 1, that you obey your parents in the Lord. Verse 4, you bring up children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. God is at the center of all of this. So the roles and responsibilities of children, like I said, children, you have one responsibility: honor your parents. Now, honoring your parents includes obedience in verse 1, where Paul says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And then he quotes from the Old Testament, honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Those are not disconnected ideas. Included in the idea of honoring is the idea of obedience. Now, it's possible to be obedient without honoring someone, to just kind of go through the motions but have a heart that is filled with bitterness and resentment. But if you honor someone, you will be obedient in the right way. I have a quote here from the Dictionary of Bible Themes that says, honor implies respect, obedience, and care for the parent's needs. Children are to honor their parents. And this doesn't mean that you honor them only when they're deserving of honor, because parents often are not deserving of honor. Parents are people. Parents are sinners who make mistakes. But you honor your parents in the Lord, right? You obey your parents in the Lord. You don't just honor them when they're deserving of honor. So that is the role of the child in the parent-child relationship. And this doesn't end when you get older. You're still a child, you still have parents, and you still honor your parents. And it's something, as we're going to get into in a moment, it's something we learn to do. All right, so our responsibility as children is to honor your parents. And this responsibility then has two benefits that Paul lists here. The first is that it may go well with you. Verse 2, honor your father and mother. And Paul parenthetically states, this is the first commandment with a promise. And the promises are as follows. One, that it may go well with you. This is a statement about a quality of life. If you're someone who trains in honoring your parents, you will naturally have a higher quality of life because that is a good thing to do. If you learn to honor your parents, even when they do things that are not always honorable, I mean, for example, that will help you in the work field, won't it? When you have bosses who don't always do things that are honorable, but you still honor them. If you learn how to do this with your parents from a young age, you will naturally have a higher quality of life. This is a good thing to learn. So first, this responsibility has two benefits. The first being that it may go well with you. The second being that you may live long in the land. In verse 3, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. This is the second part of this promise. Now, I understand this in two different ways. The first being because disobedient children were put to death. I won't have this on the board for you. You're welcome to look it up if you want. Exodus 21:17, God specifically says that whoever curses or reviles father and mother is to be put to death. So if you do not honor your parents, like, that's it. You're done. Now that's one sense in which I understand this. The second is that if you don't learn to honor your parents, you will become what the Bible refers to as a fool. A fool is someone who despises instruction and discipline, who is not happy to be instructed or disciplined, doesn't want to be corrected. And a fool is someone who often behaves in a way that their lives are cut short. So I have this here, and I do want to turn here. Hold your fingers in Ephesians. If you turn to Proverbs chapter 1. In Proverbs chapter 1, we're going to start right in the middle of verse 29. This is the personification of wisdom. And these are the words then of wisdom. In verse 29, wisdom here declares, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord, would have none of my counsel, and despised all my reproof, therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way and have their fill of their own devices. For the simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. But whoever listens to me will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread of disaster. If you don't understand this, I recommend just talking to someone who's older than you and who's a member of this congregation, and they will probably have witnessed this in their lives. That people who behave foolishly often end their lives sooner. That is how this goes. So, or they behave in ways that will come close to ending their lives sooner. Sometimes God has great mercy upon us. So this responsibility with children, back in Ephesians chapter 6, has a promise with two qualities, we'll say. The first is that it may go well with you. You have a higher quality of life when you become someone who honors your parents. The second is that you may live long in the land. You will be someone who does not despise correction, instruction, and discipline, but instead you allow yourself to be corrected, because parents often have to correct children. And you become someone who is wiser, who sees a parent's authority as good, as kind, as protective, as loving. Now, this is something that we learn. I cannot emphasize this enough. Children do not just come out knowing I've got to honor my parents. They don't come out just saying, wow, that was so wise of you to instruct me in that way. Thank you. Thank you for your wisdom, your years of sacrifice. Children don't say that. This is something we have to learn. And this is something that I think we don't stop learning even as we get older, even after we leave the house. We have to learn how to honor our parents even in their old age. How to take care of them as they become elderly and are unable to take care of themselves. Children must learn to honor their parents, and I don't think we stop learning this. So, roles and responsibilities of children. Honor your parents. It includes obedience, is a kind of respect. And you don't just honor them when they are deserving of it, but you honor them because God has put them in this position in your life. And they occupy this God-given position. Roles and responsibilities then of fathers or parents. And I need to address this for one moment, verse 4. So Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. This word fathers in the Greek is the word pater, which I'm sure you probably recognize from various other languages that have come from this. But it does not have to refer only to the male parent. In fact, it often refers to parents as a whole, but it does so by addressing the father. I'll give you an example of this. Hold your finger here and turn to Hebrews chapter 11. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. That's the same word. Now, if they were to translate this literally, because it's in the plural, it would say that he was hidden for 3 months by his fathers, which Moses did not have that. He was hidden by his parents. And you have very similarly in Ephesians 6 verse 4, and something that addresses fathers, but most likely is addressing both parents, husband and wife. Because this doesn't mean that wives are allowed to provoke their children to anger, does it? This is addressing really parents. And I think that's very consistent in what we've gone over in Ephesians 5:22 through even chapter 6, verse 9, where you have the whole family dynamic addressed. You have husbands, wives, you have children. It would be odd to have the father and not the mother included in this. So the Greek here does not have to refer only to fathers. I just want to make that clear. This is really addressing parents. And the roles and responsibilities of parents is, first, you don't provoke your child to anger or discourage them. If you want to see, there's a sister passage in Colossians chapter 3, verse 21. It says, fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. Now, the idea here is going to be pushing your child and exasperating them into intense frustration and anger. Pushing them and exasperating them into intense frustration and anger. Now, in the next few sections, I did some research and I looked up what I believe are reliable Christians who have adult children and who have raised them and tried to raise them in the Lord, what they had to say about some of these things. So the following I have from John MacArthur, if you're familiar with him. We might not agree with all of his biblical conclusions, but he had some good ideas on parenting and parenthood that I've taken from him. And he says these are some ways that a parent can push their child into anger or frustration or discouragement. So I just wanted to give you some very practical information here. For one is he says is overprotection. Never allowing a child to develop any kind of independence, but instead overprotecting them. He emphasizes God has a plan in their life, and you are not required to be God in their life. So they have to be able to develop. Overprotection, favoritism can push a child into intense frustration and anger. Pushing achievement, whether in academics or in sports, can push a child into anger and discouragement. Never giving rewards, approval, honor, or affection. Never telling them they've done well. This can discourage a child greatly. Failing to sacrifice for them. Never giving up your time, your agenda for your child, but treating your child as if they are an inconvenience and that they're really impinging on your life and your plans. Never sacrificing for them, because if they see that when you don't sacrifice for them, and they will come to feel like they are an intrusion in your life. Neglecting children. This he describes as two different things. One is using withdrawal as a means of punishment. The other is failing to discipline. That failing to discipline is a form of neglect. And lastly, bitter words and physical cruelty. Children cannot outthink you. Not in this sense. You have the power as a parent to totally destroy your child's world with words, and they can't match you. So you have to be very careful not to take advantage of that. These are some very practical ways that John MacArthur says parents can push their children into anger and discouragement. So roles and responsibilities of fathers and parents, verse 4, do not provoke your children to anger. That's one role and responsibility. The next is to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And here I've gone to another source, a man named Paul Tripp. You're welcome to look him up if you want. He's written books on this. He's given a number of talks that are very good on parenting. He also has adult children. He has raised them in the Lord. And he says that there are really two ways he understands this, because most people I've looked into will say that Ephesians chapter 4 verse 6 is an intensely loaded verse. There is so much in this verse. And he pulls out of it that there are really two ways to raise kids. The first is as an owner, as he describes. This is not raising them in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, but in your discipline and your instruction. He says when you treat children as an owner, that means the children belong to you, and your job is to instill in them what you think should be instilled in them, and to get out of them what you think you should get out of them. He says that this makes parenting about the parent's wants, the parent's needs, and the parent's principles, the parent's culture. Really, you're just taking a child and bringing them into your world and training them to be more like you. You own the children in that sense. He also points out that this means that when you discipline a child, it's because they've broken your unwritten law as opposed to God's law. This would be something like when you all get into the car, and it takes a long time to get a lot of children into the car, that they start getting hyped up, they get a little rambunctious, and they haven't broken God's law, but you're annoyed, and so you take it out on them. That is disciplining children according to your laws and your instructions and your unwritten rules in the house, as opposed to disciplining them because they have broken God's laws and God's instructions. I think this goes without saying. He, of course, advises not treating children as an owner. He says instead, you understand that your role as a parent is one as an ambassador. This is how he puts it. He says an ambassador's job is to represent the will of the one to whom you and your child belong, which is God. And this goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning. We must understand the parent-child relationship as being God-oriented. God must be a part of it. God must be central to it. And your job as a parent is to represent God's will to your child and to raise them according to God's will. He actually goes so far as to say that the job of the parent is one that is entirely representational. And your job is to represent God to your children. He says, quote, God makes his invisible authority visible by sending parents of authority to represent his authority in the lives of children who need authority. I'm going to say that one more time. God makes his invisible authority visible by sending parents of authority to represent his authority in the lives of children who need authority. This means that every time you exercise authority in the lives of your children, it must be a picture of God's authority. It can't be about our laws and our instructions, but about God's laws and God's instructions, because children need to see authority as something that is wise, as something that is patient, as something that is gracious, as something that is protecting, something that is firm, faithful, and loving. They must be trained to see authority as good. And God represents good authority. Children know when they're being taken advantage of. He says children can see when parents use their authority to turn them into little slaves. So he says, if you're sitting there and the remote control is 5 feet in front of you, don't ask your child to go get it. Just get up and get it. Your job is to represent authority as God represents authority, not to use your authority to take advantage of your child. Because your child does not belong to you, the child belongs to God. And you have been placed in this role in the child's life to represent God on God's behalf, to train them and instruct them in the discipline and instruction of the Lord, not of ourselves. This also means that when your child has spiritual struggles, it is not an interruption. It is not an inconvenience. And in fact, it is not an accident. It is God showing you what this child needs in his or her life. I don't have children, but I have a lot of nieces and nephews. And Bailey and I have lived around our nieces and nephews for many years now. Probably here we have seen them the least, but especially when we were in Boise, we used to see them all the time, multiple times every week, not just at church, but we would see them in Bailey's parents' home. And, from a very young age, you can see what a child is going to struggle with. I can tell you which of my nieces and nephews are going to struggle with things like pride, things like thinking highly of themselves, who's going to struggle with possessions, demanding this is mine and not being able to give it up. You can see from an early age what children are going to struggle with. And we don't ignore it. We don't pretend like we didn't see it. We address it. Because your role as a parent is to be an ambassador for God. And in fact, maybe God is showing you what this child needs so that you can instruct them to be able to live a life that is God-centered as they grow older. In putting this together, I really wanted to give you practical applications, especially from the perspective of parents. As I said, I have not raised children, so I consulted what I thought were reliable people who have raised children, have adult children, and raised them according to the Lord, and seen what they had to say. And I thought this in particular fits so well into Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. Not just verse 4, really verses 1 through 4, that this is all about God. And this is about children understanding their relationship to their parents through God, that God has placed them in this position in their lives. And also parents understanding their children through God, that God has given them to you. And this is a gift from God, and you don't own them, but this is a little person who has to live an entire life probably, and must do so faithfully. And your role as a parent is to represent God so that as they get older, they don't depart too much, at least, from God. That they really come to see God as good, as gracious, as firm and authoritative, but as loving. Come to see his authority as something that protects us, gives us wisdom and guides us. That's going to be Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. To raise children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. As I said, I wanted to start with this and I wanted to end with this, that the reason for and the center of the parent-child relationship and the roles and responsibilities they have toward one another is God. God is everything. He is not just a part of it. He is not absent from it. He is the reason for this relationship and the responsibilities children and parents have toward one another. So children obey their parents in the Lord. They honor their parents in the Lord. And parents raise their children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, the parent-child relationship is one of the first places we learn great spiritual truths. God calls himself our Father, and we are meant to see and call upon our own experiences with our fathers in order to better understand this. And sometimes our fathers behave in godlike ways, and sometimes they don't. And God also uses images of motherhood to describe his relationship with his people. Jesus, for example, said that he wanted to gather Jerusalem under his wings as a hen gathers her brood. And we are to call upon our own relationships with our mothers to remember the care, the protection, the oversight that they had in our lives, to recognize this as a greater spiritual truth found in God. The family is one of the first places we learn great spiritual truths. Now, the Bible affirms the goodness and the blessings of parents and children. And this relationship teaches both parents and children a lot about God. But these relationships also come with roles and responsibilities. We don't just get to enjoy them and do nothing. We all have responsibilities toward our parents, toward our children, toward one another, in understanding how our fellow Christians are raising children or maybe struggling with honoring their parents in their older age. There's so much to learn here. Because God has so much to teach us. And I wish I just had more time to spend in describing all that the Bible has to say about the parent-child role. But I don't. Now, if you're here this morning and you have questions about anything that's been said, please talk to me or anyone else. If you're here this morning and you recognize that maybe there have been some things lacking in your own life about how we honor our parents or maybe how we take care of our children, I encourage you, now's the time to change that. There's no other time better than right now to change these kinds of things. But the way we understand this relationship must be God-centered. It must revolve around God. Otherwise, our relationships will break down. We'll be inevitably disappointed in our parents. We'll inevitably be disappointed in our children. But this relationship is designed to flourish when it is God-oriented. If there's anything that we can do for you, if you need prayers, if you have something to address to the church, if you'd like to be baptized, if there's anything at all, we ask that you'd come forward now while we stand and sing the invitation song.